So today's lecture is called Collaborative Coding, and this is really a inflection point in the course. So we've now found our prototype teams, and we're going to actually start creating that prototype. So today is kind of an interesting lecture. It does require you all to really pay attention because there's a lot of different details that if you fall behind, it might be difficult to figure out how to set up your computer. This is my least favorite part about coding, but it's necessary. It's really, how do we get our computer set up so that we can actually do the coding and push that coding onto a centralized repository and all of that. So I will be very patient with you on this lecture. Please make use of the hand raising or the chat if you find yourself confused at all, and I will try to help you through it. If you have a question, if something's not working right for you, there's a good chance that someone else is also having the same problem. So let's just, I understand that there's going to be issues, and I'm here to be flexible and work with you in this lecture so that we can set you up for success on the creation of the prototype. Any questions maybe from the assignment, not so much the Codecademy assignment, but getting set up on GitHub that anyone might want to ask now? Because again, I really think if you had a problem, there's a good chance someone else had a problem as well. All right, great. Well, we'll just deal with whatever comes as we progress through the lecture. So there we have it. Let's get started on collaborative coding. You might have noticed I shared a Google Drive folder with you, and it had some documents that might not have made perfect sense, and that's okay. I think through this lecture, you'll start to really see what a Scrum doc is, what the heck a Scrum is, and how that feeds into working together as a team to develop a digital application. So the first concept that I want to introduce to you all is called the Agile Methodology. Has anyone heard of Agile? Anyone want to raise their hand? Any guesses? Yes, Kevin.
Oh yeah, I've heard of it for like software development, where they constantly iterate between different, I think, versions of the software they're developing, and then it ensures like very effective use of time while meeting the deadlines and the different user requirements.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Does that sound familiar? We said, using the words iterate and all that. Does that rhyme with something else that we learned earlier in the lecture or early in the class? Mary?
I was just going to say it's a subset of the typical engineering design process. It's basically that with a different name, because the fine details of the ideation process and the conceptual design space is very specific to coding. It's a very finicky mistress.
Yeah, and it really is interesting that in general, across multiple different industries, this isn't just a coding thing, it's also a process manufacturing, engineering principle, that we've really moved as, I guess, humankind towards this movement to be more iterative, to break projects into smaller chunks and then testing them out. I don't know if we'll end up going back, right? Is this just a one-way march where we'll never go back to...
Wait, sorry.
Go ahead.
I just kind of had a light bulb with your last sentence.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't this mimic the process we went through for learning what an MVP is?
Yes, exactly. That's sort of what I was getting at with the question of, does this remind you all of something from earlier in the class? Agile and Lean really work together, and I don't think that they necessarily intended to be that way. I think these are two different principles that came out, but there are a lot of parallels between what we learned with an MVP and what the reason for Agile methodology is. So I think you're going to continue to see these parallels as we move forward with the next few slides. So Agile is a project management methodology, and the main principle behind it is that instead of having a huge project where we try to get everything perfect before we roll it out into our customers, we want to break that project into chunks that we call iterations. And then we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slides. Another basic principle of Agile is that each iteration should include all the people within the organization that matter for the development. So maybe an anti-methodology to Agile would be that if you're going to develop new software, you would have all of maybe the functional coders, right? People are doing Python, JavaScript at one phase, and then maybe they hand that off to the front end design coders, who will then make everything look pretty. And then after that, maybe it goes to the sales and marketing team so that they can see, does this, fit our branding and all of that. So with Agile, they're saying, no, don't do that. Instead, have everybody who needs to be there for this to be released to the customer on one team. And we'll talk a bit more about that later. There's also a big principle of Agile is being willing to embrace unpredictability. And the reason for that is that if we are rolling these projects out to the customer quickly, we have to understand that we don't always know what that customer is going to give us back in terms of feedback. And so we have to be okay with, maybe we had this idea of what our project is going to look like, but as soon as we start showing these iterations to the customer, we have to be willing to embrace that they might have different thoughts and they have a little bit more weight in terms of their opinions than we do, right? Because they're the ones who are paying us. They're the ones who are using our product. So we have to be willing to embrace the fact that they might guide our product roadmap into a completely unexpected direction. And then finally, a big principle is that by practicing the Agile methodology, we are able to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. Now, this goes back to an earlier lecture, I believe lecture 2, where someone was asking if someone could pass the salt, and they waited, and then they waited, and then they said, excuse me, can you pass the salt? And they said, oh, yeah. I'm just working on a system that can arbitrarily pass you whatever condiments you might want, right? So it's not getting caught into that trap of trying to build the perfect do-it-all product, and instead giving the customer what they want early and then continuously. So just a compare and contrast, the Agile methodology, it's a focus on iterative design over big upfront design. So again, those smaller chunks and letting the customers kind of help us see which direction we need to take our design as opposed to trying to do it all at once. Experimentation over elaborative planning. So this is just, and this is always hard. And it's something that teams have to continuously remind themselves of, is rather than trying to internally decide what is the perfect roadmap or what is the perfect look of your app, it's experimenting with your customers. So has anyone ever heard of A/B testing? Anyone want to raise their hand? Yeah, Kevin?
Yeah, I think it's when you offer 2 different versions to different groups and then you ask them which one they like or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's sort of a version A, a version B, and that's your experiment, is see which version gets more interest from your customers. So that's a very common method of experimentation used in Agile, rather than just trying to figure it out right behind closed doors. Customer feedback over intuition. So again, it's trusting the customer more than ourselves when it comes to what's the right thing to add for our product. And then collaborative work over one hero. So it's talking about those cross-functional teams that can work together using Agile methodology, as opposed to just one coding genius who just creates the perfect product out of nowhere. Okay. And then another question with Agile is really, what can you accomplish in a certain amount of weeks? So if we look at the traditional approach, we have a fixed number of features. So we say, okay, in this new version of our product, we want to have X, Y, Z features. And that's fixed because we know what we want that next version or that initial MVP to look like. Now, the variables are going to be time and cost. We don't really know how long it's going to take us to build those features, and we don't know how much it's going to cost, right? So typically we'll have time overruns, cost overruns, because we know that we want to get XYZ features built, but we didn't know that it was going to be this hard because of whatever unknowns might be holding us back. And then caught in the middle is a little bit of quality, right? We don't really know, based on just the fact that we're being so fixed on what our features are going to be, and we don't know how long or how much that's going to cost. If we somehow, or in some ways, maybe lose our ability to spend as much or lose our ability to take as long as we need, that can impact quality. And by the way, the traditional approach, it's called Waterfall, right? And what it means is essentially we are going to try to plan everything up front and then have everything really be built in sequence, sort of like a Gantt chart type of sequence. And then the Agile approach, because we're breaking our work up into iterative chunks, what we're saying is we are going to spend a certain amount of time building this next version that we're going to roll out to customers, and we're going to spend a certain amount, and whatever that is, whatever we come up with in that certain amount of time, with that certain amount of spend, that is the new variable. So typically they'll have sprints that are maybe 2-week sprints. You'll have your functional team all gathered together. They'll have an idea of where they want to be. But if it happens to take 2 whole weeks to do one feature, right? So instead of XYZ, they can only get X done, then that's just what they do. And then at the end of those 2 weeks, they roll it out to the customer and they see what the feedback ends up being. So by doing that, you're really keeping your time, cost, and quality fixed, and you're just not always sure, how many features you're going to get out during that approach. And this 2-week approach, it's a good proxy for what you all are going to be doing, because obviously it's going to take you longer than 2 weeks, but because you're not working full time on this, it actually ends up translating pretty well, right? You have about 6 weeks, but maybe you're spending, 25% of your time on this. Any questions about that? This is kind of it's an interesting concept that it isn't always intuitive, but I think if you really look at it, it's a great illustration of how Agile works. It's all about, let's get this out to the customer. And if it takes too long to do it, that's fine. We just won't do quite as much. Okay, so a little bit more about waterfall development versus Agile. So with waterfall, everything is delivered in one big bang. So you say, hey, this will take a full year to do, and it'll take us a certain amount of cost, let's say $100,000, and we don't really see the fruits of what we've built until the very end. And now, when we do that, risk goes significantly up, right? Because if we don't know the result of our product development until the end, we will have ended up spending this amount, right? So that full amount of the project before we know if it was even worth it to spend that full amount. And we don't know if it's worth it until the end because we haven't shown the customers what we've built until, say, that full year's time. Another emphasis is how all the difficult decisions are in the beginning. So you can imagine if you're going to commit a year and a year's worth of money to a project, you better get it right at the start. You better know that you're building the right thing. And so all of the difficult decisions really are front loaded. And then you just wait for the project to complete before you know whether they were the right ones. Now with Agile, what you're doing is you're breaking this huge goal into a bunch of smaller goals. And in doing so, you're actually reducing the risk, because at the end of each goal, you are getting that feedback of whether or not you're on the right track. And you can adjust based on that. You could even kill the project if you realize that you're completely off base because the customers are just not feeling what you're trying to build for them. So in doing so, your risk is significantly reduced, even if the total cost and time of the entire project is the same, right? If in this scenario, we have 1 year, $100,000 to do, this one, maybe it's 1 year, $100,000, but each iteration is broken down into maybe 3 months and 25,000, right? And we can kill the project or adjust the project at the end of each iteration. Does that make sense? So essentially, by giving us these sort of decision points where we can see how we're doing, the customers are enjoying what we're giving them, that can decrease the overall risk of the project. And you might have heard this in clinical trials a little bit, right, throughout your KGI curriculum, where it's with clinical trials, you can have this huge risk of a phase 3 trial failing, but we're now talking more about adaptive clinical trials that might enable us to kill the project early if we see that maybe it's not all going according to plan, or make an adjustment to help make sure that it becomes a success. So in some ways, I don't think they're calling it Agile, but in some ways, even on the clinical trial regulatory side, they're starting to adopt the principles of incremental development. So I'd also like to do a little compare and contrast between Waterfall and Agile in terms of the team and how the team is constructed. So with the Waterfall approach, it's a lot more sequential, right? You might start with more of a business analysis. These might be more of your high level staff who are going to figure out, okay, what are the important decisions that we must make in order to make sure that this project is successful and it's something that will help bring value to our customers and therefore our company. After that, you might get handoff to someone who's more architecture focused. So how do we build the framework that will help make sure that our development project ends up doing what it needs to do? And then it just sort of goes up the chain to finally the people who are actually building the product itself on the development side. And then even within this green development, that might be broken down into the different components of front end, back end, and then maybe different features within that, right? So it's all very sequential. You have different teams doing their job and then handing it off to the next team. And then there's often not a lot of looking back, right? Because once the business analysis people do their job within the Waterfall approach, they might then move on to something else. And so they're much less likely to be engaged if maybe midway through the project, people are starting to ask questions of, oh, did we do a full analysis on some sector of what we're trying to create? And then it becomes hard to re-engage these business analysts because they've sort of already wiped their hands and they're moving on to something else. And then also there's a general principle within the Agile school of thought that 50% of knowledge gets lost in the handoffs, right? So that you sort of get your instructions or your inputs from each team that did their job, and then it's up to your interpretation. And I'm sure you all have played that game of telephone, and you see how what the person at the start of the telephone game says gets turned into something completely different through the interpretations of each handoff. So contrast that with Agile, right? Agile, they follow this basic principle of measure, learn, build, and then repeat. So measure how your product is interacting within the customer ecosystem, learn from the analytics that you get from that. And in our case, that main measurement and learning part is going to be through user testing. So you'll see how they interact with your product, and then build features that help address those learnings. Once you do that, roll those features out to the customer, and then measure, again, how they interacted with those new features, learn from that, and then build features on top of that that take into account their feedback. So it's this iterative path towards success in terms of how your product addresses your customer needs. And then also going back to terminology, your customer stories, your user stories that you'd created, right? Are we solving an important problem for them? And then another buzzword within Agile is T-shaped people. So if you look at the waterfall approach, if you're a business analyst and you're never really interacting with the people in development, you get really good and focused at your business analysis, but you never really understand what's going on here. With Agile, because we're forcing these people to work together, they start to build competencies. They understand, they see the experts in a given domain work, and they start to build their own competence around those other domains. So it creates these people who maybe they have a focus. Let's say someone who's really got a focus in graphic design, but they also have a good idea because of the teams that they've been working on. What goes on with architecture, what goes on with business analysis, what goes on in development. And so that enables them to work more effectively together to solve problems. And you all are going to be this too, right? Because within this course, you are learning all of the different aspects of coding, but you're going to focus in on a specific aspect. So you might be the person who's in charge of HTML, but you're also learning CSS, you're learning JavaScript, you're learning the user testing part. So you understand what your teammates are doing and you can help and provide feedback, right? So it's sort of like we're all in charge of a certain aspect of our product, but we're also not ignorant of what's going on in the other parts of the team. So now getting into some of the terminology. The first real aspect that I'd like to go over is something called the product backlog. And now the product backlog is something that you've had a little bit of experience in this class with so far. It's sort of when you started with those user stories, right? You created a list of functions that you wanted to build to address those user stories. And those become the inputs to that product backlog. Now, as you get more complex with your team and the product that you are creating, a product backlog might also get a little bit more fancy, right? It'll be owned by a product owner who will then own that backlog and help prioritize and build what they call a roadmap for their product. So you'll do that a little bit, right? You're definitely going to prioritize and you're going to have an idea of what are the development tasks that need to be completed, but it'll be on a more simple level. But you can imagine it getting more complex if, say, you're a Google product owner, right? And there's millions of data points from your customer feedback coming in, and you're trying to figure out which of these do we actually address? How does that impact our customers' happiness? How does that impact where we want to be with this product in 5 years? So it becomes a lot of work in terms of figuring out what should our sequence of development activities be. And that, by the way, is what feeds into our what we call sprints. And we'll talk about that later, but just to remind you all of this slide, a sprint is something with a defined time, defined cost, and then a defined quality. And by the way, this quality is just saying sort of like, if we keep time and cost fixed and we don't worry about the amount of features we do, we can keep the same high level of quality, right? Because we're not saying, oh my God, we just need to like get all these features done. Who cares how great they are? So this fixed time and cost becomes a sprint. Okay, so who runs a sprint? Well, it's the Scrum team. And the Scrum team, in the words of Agile, is the awesome cross-functional team of those T-shaped people, co-located. We'll probably have to give a little bit of pause to that terminology because of COVID, but they have a mandate and the leeway to make decisions on the business and then also the solutions that they're gonna develop that will provide user value. And they also have the competencies needed to build and ship it. So if we go back again to Waterfall, right, you have a limited skill set and authority based on what step you are in the process. If I'm graphic design, I don't get to make decisions about architecture. But if I'm on a team and I'm graphic design and architecture is also on that team, I can ask questions if I think that something's important that's missing within architecture, or maybe make suggestions. And because we're working together, that input actually has value and can change the scope of the project. So by putting all these people together, you are empowering people to make decisions across the continuum of what needs to happen for product development. The other thing that I will highlight is the Agile Coach or Scrum Master. So this is sort of it's a interesting position because they're not really doing the actual development work, but what they're doing is making sure that the people doing the development work are following the process. So in some ways, they're sort of like a project manager, right? Where they're really good at the process stuff, and they actually have to know everything else, but their deep expertise is within process as opposed to development. Scrum board. So this is something that you'll see in the Google folder that I shared with you all. And this is just a very effective way to keep track of who's doing what, when, are we on track? So this is sort of your equivalent of a Gantt chart, right? But it doesn't really need to be a Gantt chart, whereas Waterfall would be heavily dependent on a Gantt chart because that project is so complex from getting from day one of your project to a whole year later or whatever that time frame might be, that you need this complex timeline and Gantt chart with different roles and responsibilities. With Scrum board, it's just a little bit simpler, right? We've built functional requirements based on our product backlog, and it's just okay. Let's do them. Let's get them done. See how, or try to get as many done as we can, and then just track how are they progressing along the continuum of not done yet, doing it, working on it versus done. Another thing that I'd just like to re-emphasize, because I mean, you'll notice I'm sort of like a broken record when it comes to user stories. I want to see that everything you do feeds into a user story, because it's your users who are the most important with this, and don't get too held up in like building a about us or a registration or something like that. It's focused on what delivers that success for the user, and then building a backlog of tasks to fulfill that user story, and then tasks, and then DOD. Actually, I don't know what that is. But anyway, we're tracking the tasks from to do to doing to done. Okay. And then sprints. So we call this an Agile Heartbeat. You're not going to have as much of an experience with the actual heartbeat. This is a little bit more meta, because essentially what you're doing is one sprint, right? And you have to get this done within the time frame of the rest of the course, right? But if you were working for a company and you were involved in several different sprints, it's very helpful to keep track of that cadence, right? A very common cadence is every 2 weeks, you complete a sprint, and then you deliver that to the customer, and then you measure the feedback from the customer, build the next sprint, and then just keep going, right? In your case, I guess the cadence that you will see will be these daily stand-ups. And because, again, you were not working like that, right? You're not full-time employees. Instead of daily, it'll be weekly or bi-weekly. So that'll sort of be your heartbeat within a sprint, is having those meetings where you're all getting on the same page. You know who's doing what, the to do, the doing, the done. You're making sure everything's moving to the right, so that you can get the MVP out by the end of the class. Within these stand-ups, you look at the backlog, you try to make sure that what you're working on brings the most value to your user stories. You're then planning the sprint. You say, hey, we're going to need some JavaScript work done in the coming week to help build this, let's call it a diagnostic algorithm, something like that. We're also, the nav bar and the basic website's kind of ugly. We could use a little bit of CSS to make it more beautiful and user-friendly. We go through what is our goal at the end of the sprint, knowing that this is variable, right? We're not saying, hey, we have to get these 10 tasks done. We're constantly reanalyzing. Is our original thought of what that goal might be still achievable, or do we just really need to focus on maybe one or two instead of 5 things to get done, so that those 1 or 2 things look great and reflect the needs of our user? Then do a review after a sprint to see how did that go? Are there things that we need to work on to make sure that the next sprint is more effective? And then in retrospect, we really do that post hoc, not only of how the sprint went, but whether the customer was eventually satisfied by what we delivered to them. So again, just reinforcing that it's a constant back and forth between discovery and delivery, right? We're discovering things that are or are not going well, frustrations of our customer, maybe frustrations within the sprint of things that went well or didn't go so well. And then we are delivering fixes that address what we discovered. And that's what leads to having a product that users want to use, want to pay for, and then we have a successful application. Mary, you have a question?
Yeah, since the algorithm's being coded in JavaScript, is that why we're using Visual Studios? Because I know Visual Studios can be kind of wonky for HTML and CSS a little bit, like at least from my completely biased experience. And I know it's better for JavaScript. Is that why we're using, one reason why we're using it?
So the main reason why I recommended Visual Studio is because it's more full featured. So I've used personally 2 text editors, Visual Studio and Sublime Text. I used to recommend that the class could just choose between the 2. But Sublime Text, it requires a little bit more individual customization to get it to work well with GitHub, to push changes through and all of that. You have to work with your command line a little bit more. And what I found was that students some had a difficult time working through those different customizations that are needed. Whereas Visual Studio Code is just all built within the application. So if I have that open and I make a change to index.html, Visual Studio Code can show me exactly what those changes are. I can just hit a plus sign to commit that change, and then a check sign to then send that over to GitHub, right? Whereas with Sublime Text, you have to sort of like type it all out on your terminal, which was just a little bit less user-friendly for people. Now, if you want to use one of the other text editors, you are more than welcome to. But the one that I'm going to teach off of to help make sure your city or your computer is all properly set up will be the Visual Studio Code. Okay. That said, if you have questions and you want to use Sublime Text, I won't hold it against you. And I'm happy to answer any questions on office hours, or if you want to send me an email, I'll try to address it in writing. Cool. Okay, sprint backlog. So our main goal here is to group and rank our user stories, right? That's step one. So we've come up with some user stories in the wireframe. I would encourage you as a team in your first meeting to go through some of those user stories, maybe even come up with additional user stories, and then decide as a team which one you think is going to be most important to include in your MVP. Once you've done that, you're going to develop functions that address each user story and then rate the difficulty to complete on a 1 to 3 points basis. And that's going to help you figure out where you need to focus. Now, this is less important for you to do on your project, but if you were at a company that's following Agile methodology, they would want to calculate a daily velocity. And that is essentially the difficulty points divided by the amount of time that you have to complete it, right? So it's sort of how many points of work need to be completed in what amount of time. And then that's almost like a miles per hour type of thing, right? It's like, I need to do these 10 points of difficulty tasks in 2 weeks, and that's my velocity. It doesn't really mean anything the first time you do it, right? Because it's sort of a relative thing. But if you're at a company that's doing a bunch of these, it gives you a good sense of whether your sprints are accomplishing the right amount of work in the right amount of time, or whether sort of you had kind of a lazy sprint, more of a jog, right? And so that helps you assess the quality of the Agile sprints that you're executing on. And then user test constantly, right? Again, I'm going to keep saying it, broken record. It's that whole measure and then learn from the measurement and then build features that address what you learned, and then measure again how the features that you built are taken up within your users or your customers. And then wash, rinse, repeat, keep going. So remember, measure, learn, build, measure, learn, build, so on and so forth. Okay. Definitely user test constantly. Now, I'll just sort of give you all a little bit of color into how previous classes have gone. The reason why I moved your wireframe up a lecture, and I'm glad I did it because you all did a great job, so you didn't need the extra lecture to complete your wireframes, is that now you have an extra week to build something usable to a user. Definitely not complete, but usable, so that when you put that out there for user testing, you can get really good feedback. So that's sort of your first goal, is try to get something that looks somewhat reminiscent of what you're trying to build, so that when your users play with it, they know what you're trying to do and they can give you good feedback on it. Mary?
Yeah, for our testing pool, is it people from our class, or do we just go and find people?
Yeah,
Like-
it's historically it's been a lot of people from class. It could be family members. You know, it's always sort of a bonus if you're able to, let's say you're building something for physicians, to actually get a physician to take a look at it. I'm going to see how we're going, right? But
there's a couple of them, you know, projects
yeah.
that we might not be able to find.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
With the condition, like
definitely. But as an example, so for the period tracker app, that
Yeah.
really, like, it doesn't make sense to user test with
males.
right?
Well, yeah, but like the Alzheimer's, the IDAP. Like,
Yeah, exactly. So
you
there's
can
some where
like
it's
back
going to
down
be,
to someone.
yeah, there's somewhere it will be very difficult to find the right users, and that's okay, right? It's, I think using your classmates is perfectly acceptable. But I'm giving you more time, so try to take advantage. And these teams are larger, by the way. I mean, this class is about twice the size of our previous classes. So you all can afford to have someone who focuses a little bit more on the user testing And so that might work to your advantage. But we'll see how this progresses, right, as we move forward. I mean, we're not going to really be, I'll talk about user testing next week. And there won't really be an expectation that you have all the user testing started and figured out until probably about two or even 3 weeks from now. Okay. Okay, Scrum board. So it's sort of starting with the user stories, moving on to how that creates to-dos that we end up having to do to address those stories, build those functions that address those stories, what's in progress, what's been sort of completed as an early draft and just needs to be verified by the team. And then once that verification happens, it moves over to done. And by having this visual board that you all have in the form of a Google Sheet, you're able to really track how the project is progressing and make adjustments if you need to, because obviously, and the nice thing about this class is that there is no such thing as changing the timeline, right? Once it's finals time, it's got to be done. So you have the ultimate fixed timeline. And so you'll be able to see through this board how much you really need to crank things up or maybe narrow the scope on to make sure that you get something useful out there to the customer or really to us, right, to evaluate by the end of the class. Okay, so user stories, the to-dos are then the functions that fulfill the user stories, and then we just track progress once we've developed that. Okay, so team activity. I am going to put you all into breakouts, and I'd like you to assign roles, create to-dos from your user stories, and then determine what are good days and times for your stand-up meetings. Now, I am going to exit out of here and just show you a project from last year. So in this case, they had, what you're going to see is basically this, but without the names. You can fill in names, and this is not a fixed thing, right? We can change it as we move along, but at least try to get a sense for who feels the most confident in taking on certain aspects, so that you can have a good idea of what you might want to be focusing on as a team member to make sure that you're carrying your weight on the project. And then you can start to think about, okay, what is a user story that I want to address? What are the to-dos that need to be created in order to address that user story? And then later, obviously not today, you'll start filling in whether you're working on it, or it's been done and verified, etc. And then stand-up meetings are used to just take notes about what did you do, what are you gonna be working on, and then do you have any needs that some of your teammates can help you with? Okay. Any questions about the format of this before I break you all into groups? All right, great. All right, so assign roles, create the to-dos from user stories, and then determine your stand-up meeting days and time. So what I have to do now is create the breakout groups. Okay, so I'm creating the rooms. Just need to put the right names in, and then just go ahead and join the room that you're a member of. Okay. Is it working for you all?
Wait,
Hi,
what?
how are you all doing?
Good.
So is everything clear about how to sort of get into your documents? Okay, great.
Not cahoots.
So you can just join the Scrum docs.
There you are.
No thanks, Mary.
Yeah. Otherwise, you have to go into your email.
Okay. I will come back, but just let me know if you have any problems.
And y'all, here's the drive link for the user testing script.
Drive.
Hi, everyone. Just checking in. Do you all know how to access your Scrum docs?
Yeah, I think we just found that it was the file that you shared with us previously in Google Drive, correct?
Correct. Yeah, and it might be helpful. One of the other teams, they just put it in the chat for the breakout team. So if someone's got the link, you can just share it in the chat and everyone else can go in there.
Okay, great.
Cool. So just use the Scrum docs for this exercise, and I'll come back, but I'm just going to check with all the other teams, make sure they're clear. Any other questions before I leave?
No, I think that's it. Thank you.
All right.
Okay.
I think roles might be easier first to do, but I don't know. Hello.
Hi, how are y'all doing? Can everyone access the Scrum docs okay?
Yeah, we have them pulled up.
Okay, great. Any questions for me? I'm sort of first doing the rounds to make sure everyone can get the documents open. But here for any questions, and then I'll come back once I figure you've made more progress.
I think we're good. Yeah.
All right, sounds good. I'll be back.
Because JavaScript is a very specific coding.
Yeah.
Hi, how are y'all doing? Looks like you've got the Scrum doc open. Any questions?
We have one person missing, so we'll have to figure that out. So this is democracy for 3 people, but not for one person.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
You know what you'll find, I think, as you complete the Codecademy courses on JavaScript, that maybe one or two of you gravitate towards that more than
It's
the
gonna be
other.
me because I have a very personal. I used to scrape code. I used to web scrape for Illumina,
Oh,
and
cool.
so I used to read a lot of HTML.
Mhm.
So that's why I'm like, but since websites moved on to do a lot more JavaScript, they always stumped me. So I really want to know how to hack
Good.
JavaScript.
Cool. All right,
So,
yeah,
yeah.
and we'll definitely in the ensuing lectures show a couple like very basic JavaScript API types of moves that you can do to, get some cool, like a lot cooler looking than it took to actually build features into the platform.
Yeah, so that's why I don't mind doing JavaScript by myself. And QA, I'm not sure when you say QA, is that more like testing the site works and whatnot?
Yeah, so QA will be a little bit more focused on finding bugs. So user testing will
Okay.
help with the finding of bugs. But QA within a development project team, it's usually the person who is familiar with all the different aspects, but maybe not super deep into any particular one. And they can make sure that everything is talking to each other well, right? Because
Okay.
if you are this team, someone might build something really cool, but it just doesn't hook up right with what everyone else has built. So it's
Okay.
helping make sure that everything is coherent within the application.
All right, that sounds like my job. Okay.
All right.
I should be fine with that just because I think I have, then by the time I finish the code academy for JavaScript, I'll have JS and also some HTML and like real world HTML experience, but also a little bit of code academy CSS experience.
Perfect. All right. Any other questions? But I'll be back. But I'm just sort of doing the rounds to make sure everyone knows
got
the
it.
basics of what we're
And
doing.
we can call you, I think, from this thing, I think, unless you disabled it.
I believe you can. Yeah.
Okay, I'll figure it out. Thanks.
All right. Great.
Like the directory Broken Bones as an example.
How are y'all doing?
Hey.
Good.
Everything clear on the doc side? I'm sort of doing the rounds. I'll be back, but doing the rounds just to make sure that the basics of getting access to the Scrum doc and all that are going okay.
Yeah, we've got that set up. The only question we really had was like on the feedback for the wireframe, it was about the user story. Was it more of like gearing it towards educational purposes or just like sharing photos?
Let's see. So this was the Reddit for imaging. I know part of that was that people might have different use cases for what they're going to do with the images. And so focusing in on, what is the most important use case for you, right? Because there's a lot of ways. There's a company called CrowdMed as a good example where if you were going to try to use this for diagnostics, on CrowdMed, you would have a bunch of physicians who maybe have a difficult case, and they'll post the case, a description of the case for the other physicians on the network to view. And then those other physicians can give their diagnosis. And I think they even had like a payment system to incentivize people who gave a good diagnosis to keep helping others. So that's one direction to go. And I'm not saying at all that that's the direction you want to go, but for you, it could be like the imaging version of that, right?
Yeah.
Or it could just be something that's more educational and something where maybe med students are using it to share their cases and get feedback. So many different directions. I think this is a really cool one that could go in a lot of different directions. And no matter which direction you get, it's going to look good, right? Because of the fact that you have this image focused, almost like a Pinterest type of thing. So that'll be fun too. Any other questions?
For the stand-up meetings, these are our own meetings, right? Not the class meetings.
Correct. Yeah, so these will be, well, I'm gonna try to create most lectures some space for you all to have conversations, work on your projects during the class. But you'll definitely want to have at the very least one meeting per week where your team is getting together outside of class to discuss the project.
Okay.
Any questions about the roles? Is that pretty clear?
Yeah, I think we split up all the roles. I think we just got to figure out what direction we want to take the the website.
All right, sounds good.
Huh?
Morning should work for me.
Hi, how are you all
Tuesday
doing?
morning. Okay.
Hey, doing good.
Sounds like you've got your docs open and that part's figured out.
Yeah, yeah.
Any questions about the docs themselves or about the roles?
I'm assuming we'll find out what JavaScript entails, right?
Yeah, definitely. JavaScript is an interesting one. It's the language that ideally one of you three will be like, oh, I kind of like this because it's for sure the most powerful one. But if I'm honest, it's a little bit binary in terms of whether people end up getting it or not. Right? It's sort of like some people have that aha moment and some people never quite get it during the class. And I won't punish you for that, right? It's if you don't get it, but you focus really heavily on the other stuff, then that's great. So none of you sound like you're super excited about JavaScript yet, right? So that
don't have exposure, so we don't know
yeah.
what to expect yet. Yeah.
So that's something I'll definitely take a personal note with this team to try to make sure that if we don't have that aha moment with any of you guys, we can figure out what we need to do to help work with that, right? And sometimes it's just a matter of maybe we have a surgery VR adjacent JavaScript example that you all can work with. And then you just have to adapt it to what you're trying to do.
Okay, sounds good.
Cool. And is this just want to clarify, is this the full team or are you all missing anyone?
This is it.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, so definitely the fact that it's a team of three. I want to work with you all to make sure that you don't feel like you're missing the personnel needed to be successful. And have you all worked together? I know Alexa and Sophia, you're MSMD, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So hopefully that helps a little bit with the scheduling. But again, just let me know if you have any issues or need any assistance. Any other questions? All right. How about with regard to the wireframe? Do you feel like between that and sort of some of the feedback I provided that you know what you want to focus on to make this successful?
Yeah, we're just gonna focus on the patient side. So it'll be recovery VR instead of surgery VR.
Okay.
And then instead of trying to do like full simulations, I was thinking we could sort of just have like pop-up bubbles where it's just sort of like, okay, this or that, and then they can choose one and have it sort of be like a story. So I figured that would simplify it, but I'm sure I'll find better ways as well.
Yeah, for sure. And you know what you're describing, obviously that's a very sort of basic version of what it'll end up being, but like the concept of that is something that you're going to definitely be able to build. And I think it should look pretty cool. All right. Now go ahead and you can just ping me if you have any other questions you want me to hop back into the room.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Will.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, for sure.
Okay. Sounds good.
Hi, how are y'all doing?
Hello, we're doing
Good.
well. We're just splitting up. We set up a time to meet, and then we're talking about the roles now. And
Great.
then we talked a little bit about the different user stories that we wanted to add, but we weren't sure if you wanted us to fill this part out as well, the user testing.
So user testing, I'll go through that in the lecture next week. And then you can start getting ready for that. So whoever you put in charge of user testing, definitely take a look. But you won't have to start working on that yet. I'm actually kind of giving you all an extra week or two before you start user testing, because what I found in previous classes is sometimes their prototypes aren't really usable going into the user testing. So I want to make sure you got something that is worth showing to someone so that you can get good feedback.
Okay.
I have another question. So
Yes.
we're gonna work on, yeah, with HTML and CSS.
Mhm.
And like, are we gonna have like introduction class for JavaScript or?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
okay.
that will be a part of the Codecademy. And then it will also be one of the main things that I focus on in terms of in-lecture coding. So I'll show you how to build like an algorithm with JavaScript and make that provide a diagnosis, things like that. And then you'll be able to take the basic principles of what I show you and then adapt them into features that are useful for your project, for Insurance Finder.
Okay, yeah, because sometimes I do have like, it's been always my problem of connecting the back end with the front end. So are we gonna have like this class of the transition of both of them, like the implementing both?
Yes, I will say that there will still be one missing component, which is you won't be using any like purely back-end language. Technically, JavaScript is sort of a front end, but what you will be able to do is put data within your JavaScript data structures and sort of treat that as a backend, and then show how those data structures can make something look functional on the front end.
Okay, okay.
So that it'll be like almost take you there, but to really close the loop, you would want to learn PHP, Python, something like that.
Yeah. All right.
But definitely, I like that question a lot. So if you want to think about that even more and maybe send me an email or something, I could give you even more detailed feedback in terms of how to close that loop between what you do on the back end and what you can do on the front end.
Okay, thank you. That'll be super helpful.
Great. Any other questions? You all feel pretty confident about your ability to create a prototype?
And do our best.
All right, I believe in you. And because your team is only 3, if you found that I tried to, based on the feedback that you gave me in lecture 1 in terms of your experience, I tried to create balanced teams. But if you feel that there's a skill gap, then let me know about that, and I'll try to help you get through that skill gap. I was telling one of the other teams that JavaScript, it can be a little bit binary, and that it's sort of you either get it or you don't. And if I'm honest, sometimes not every student in the class ends up getting it, right? And that's okay, because you can focus more of your effort on HTML, CSS, QA, user testing, so on and so forth. But if nobody on the team ends up having that magic moment where they get it, then let's just chat about it, right? And I'll try to help make either maybe during office hours, I can help show you examples, more examples that are more relevant maybe to your project or something like that. So just let me know.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to probably close out the breakout groups very soon. So whatever you need to finish up, go ahead and have those discussions. And we're back. Okay, it sounds like everyone is in pretty good shape in terms of getting their team started. So I'm excited about that. A couple questions that came up that I'd like to go over while everyone's here. First off, what is QA? Would anyone like to answer that question for me?
Quality assurance.
And what do they do?
Oh, well, I guess in terms of an app or a website, you're making sure what you're developing aligns as a potential solution to. So you have your user story. From there, you're going to generate your user needs based off of your MVP. And the quality assurance is making sure that's in line with the user need and also the user testing. And it's going to reiterate whether or not what part of the agile cycle you're going to have to go back to, revise, or be done.
Yeah, I think that's a good assessment of sort of part of the scope. Now, I think with that description, there's a little bit of blurring between PM and QA, right? So anyone else want to talk a little bit about what might be the differentiation and maybe talking about some of the specifics of what the QA does? I know, Kevin, you had your hand up, and I think I talked to your group about it. So maybe you could give us a good answer.
Okay, sorry, I had a question for something else.
Oh, gotcha.
But what was the question you had for QA?
Well, so I think Mary gave a good description of sort of the grand scope of QA PM and how they make sure that the features that we build, they fit within the user story and the agile process. How might you differentiate between what a PM does and what a QA does?
The QA is more like bug testing versus the Scrum Master is like a program. More concerned with timeline and meeting milestones.
Yep, that's a good answer. So the QA will be looking at, from a product standpoint, we've got these different people building different parts of the product. Do they fit together? And do they fit together in a way that will provide the functions that satisfy the user story that we expect? And part of that is bug testing, right? Making sure that the different components really fit together. And then another part is just making sure, did we even build the right component, right? So it's sort of that final step from when a feature is built to when we incorporate that into our product. And did you have a question also?
Yeah, for our groups, since it's for Alzheimer's, we have for the user testing, I can just test it to my mom because she probably can qualify, but would there be what do you call it, issues with ethics? Do we have to get like a specific form because it's a senior patient?
That's actually a really good question. I would say that there are no issues with ethics as long as you leave any user's name out of it, right? If it's a patient. Now, if it's just testing with a classmate, don't worry about that part. But if it's something where this particular user is sensitive in some way because maybe they're a patient themselves, I would basically de-identify the information so that you can't trace that back to who they actually are as a person.
Thanks.
Right. Okay. Great. So that's one big component about QA, right? I think that was the one that was sort of the least clear based on what I've told you all so far. And then, by the way, when I said PM, I meant Scrum Master. So the Scrum Master is just sort of the agile jargon for a project manager or a PM. Okay. Another concern that I think some of the teams justifiably had was around JavaScript. JavaScript, it is a more difficult language to get than HTML and CSS. And as I explained to some of the teams, it's a little bit, in my experience, binary in terms of some people will get it and enjoy the power that it gives them as a developer. Some people just won't. And that's okay. That's why there's multiple job roles within your given Scrum teams. So if you just don't get JavaScript, that's fine. You can focus on some of the other roles and do a great job in that way. Also, don't feel like because your name got put next to a particular language or function that you need to stick with that. If it turns out that your team, you know, based on Codecademy assignments, based on what you've seen, you feel that you would like to switch the roles up a little bit, then you can do that. And then also remember we're T-functional teams, right? Or T-functional team members. So just because your name's not next to HTML doesn't mean that you don't do HTML. It's definitely something that you can do and you know, document that you did it in your Scrum docs, and then I'll know you did it, and that'll look good on you for the participation grade. Okay. Any questions before we move forward? Were you all able to get everything to a place where you feel confident in how your team is going to take that next step to starting to work on this prototype? All right, great. And if you realize after the class that you're not confident, there's always office hours and there's always email. So for stand-up meetings, you know, there's a lot within the Agile in terms of how these can be run. But this is, I would say, my KGI ALS414 interpretation of how these stand-up meetings typically can go well for your team. So try to think about 10 meetings between now and the end of this sprint. Conveniently sort of one outside of class per week, plus some of the in-class time that I'll give you all to work together should fulfill that. Think about the meeting being about 15 minutes. It's not a huge deal if it goes over, because you know, it's not like you all are working next to each other all the time. So you might be starved for each other's company. So if you want to go over, that's fine. Or if you're at a point where everyone knows what they need to do and it's just a matter of putting your head down and getting it done, they can be shorter. It's not a big deal. Try to make sure that they are regularly scheduled. Again, usually this is a daily thing, so that you start the day knowing what you need to do to be a contributor. But that's not realistic here. So what I'm thinking is 2 times per week, and that's including time that you had for your lecture. So on Monday, you'll know, hey, today you all met, right? So this was your first stand-up. So try to have one more meeting this week, and then try to plan for one outside of lecture next week. And I will try to give you time to do your meeting during lecture. Won't always happen, but you'll know obviously by the end of Monday whether you got enough time for your team to collaborate. Okay. And then the main questions that I love to ask in a meeting like this is sort of, what did I do yesterday, or in this case, since the last meeting? What do I plan on doing today, or in this case, until the next meeting? And then are there any impediments to me accomplishing that? And so I set up your Scrum docs to ask to fill those in a very similar way, right? And then in terms of impediment, this is a key one. It's really being honest with your team about what the challenges are for you getting something done, so that your teammates can help you. Maybe you shuffle roles a little bit. Maybe someone who is T-shaped in their functionality will jump in and help you out a little bit. Or maybe you help someone else out because they're struggling a bit. Okay, so this is essentially how these teams work. And it's how things will work after you graduate. Even if you're not in development, it's if things are running smoothly, usually there's some sort of daily or regular check-in on how everyone's doing. Are they getting their work done? Do they need help from the rest of the team? Okay. Any questions about that? Well, that concludes Agile. Oh, this is just sort of the Google sheet, right? That says, what did I do? What am I gonna do? What do I need? Okay. And then you can pre-fill these with your expected meetings. Oh yeah. And then I need to see that this is filled out. So this is a big document that I end up going back to for grading to make sure that the participation was even throughout the group, right? It's not just this. It's also my observations of how you all are interacting with each other in the meetings. I can see who's pushing code into GitHub, that whole thing, which we'll go over next. But this is a big document that I use to figure out who participated and what grade should they get because of that. This concludes Agile Methodology. Just to sum it up in 1 minute, we create this product backlog based off of our user stories, also our user testing that will probably add a few more items to that backlog. We create this cross-functional, awesome Scrum team that works together with each other to get this done. There's no blind handoff. It's I hand it off to you, wipe my hands. You're stuck with each other. You all need to be involved with every part of the project for it to go well, even if certain people are the owners who are accountable more so than others for a given facet of the project. We use that Scrum board to see how we're doing at a given time. I'll be looking at those Scrum boards regularly to understand where things are with you all and give you help, feedback where needed. And then we're sort of doing a weird translation of a sprint from being an everyday thing for 2 weeks to being a every week thing for the remainder of this class. Okay. And then of course, remember this constant interaction between discovering through interaction with your customer and iteration to then building solutions to that and then iterating. So the other version of this is, right, it's measure, learn, build, measure, learn, build, ad infinitum, right? So we're doing that in small chunks that are measurable so that we can end up with a product that reflects the needs of our customer. So this is the big inflection point, right? I hope that you all feel that this sort of tied a lot of concepts that we learned about MVP, about lean, about wireframing, user stories, Agile methodology together so that you understand how to develop a product that is pleasing to the customer or the user. And then next up, we're going to focus on coding and getting all of those concepts into a digital application. Mary, you have a question.
I'm sorry, what were in the stand-up meetings, like, what do we put for needs? Like, I'm still not clear. Like, do you write notes on like, we need help with this part or?
Sure. So if we go back to the stand-up meetings, so you would have individual team member names in the columns, and then you will just fill out on a given day, sort of, what did I do? What do I plan on doing between now and the next meeting? And then what do I need? And the need, it's not really for me, right? I mean, it helps me to see it, but if you need my help, don't try to get it through this document, try to just email me. And that way it'll be front of mind for me, right? It's more for each other. So it's, and you might not always have a need, right? It might just be more, hey, I'm good. But it might be, hey, I'm working on this JavaScript algorithm over here, and I don't see any place for me to put that within your page. Can you create a page that would be, let's call it a diagnosis page, right? Where you can click a button and then I will insert my JavaScript into that button so that it comes up with a diagnosis, that sort of thing, right? Because you are all ultimately dependent on each other to make a working prototype. I've seen prototypes that have been very strong on one aspect, right? Very strong on, let's say, JavaScript, but they were very poorly done design-wise. So it's talking to each other to make sure that there's some level of balance.
And then, like for this week, it's fine if we've all pretty much accomplished and are working on the same things, because like, at least for my group, we need to work on deciding on user stories and establishing a clear MVP. And that's like, we're all working on that right now, and we can't do anything without it.
Yeah, and that's perfectly fine, right? Especially this week, you're gonna, if you're doing well, you push a little tiny bit of code onto GitHub. But what you're really going to want to work on is aligning on your mockup, as you said, making sure that everyone is configured properly so that they can work on the code together, and all of that. So that's going to be a lot of your needs in the coming week. And if you focus on that and focus on getting all of that right and done, then you'll be set up for success in the ensuing weeks. But if you sort of try to look ahead and start coding, but you never really got set up on GitHub, or you never aligned on a wireframe, that could come back to bite you. So I think you're completely right that we might be a little bit more in lockstep for this first week and a little bit less saying, hey, I'm doing HTML, you're doing JavaScript, don't worry about each other, right? So this is going to be a little bit more logistical tasks to make sure that everything's aligned as a team. Okay, any questions about that? Yes, Alexa.
I had a question about the daily velocity. Is that something that we need to be doing also on these sheets, or is that something separate for like the user testing?
So daily velocity, I just wanted to share it with you all because it's an interesting concept. But it's really more of a concept that a company will use that is working on multiple sprints. Because let's say that your velocity is 10 units of difficulty per sprint, right? And each sprint is 2 weeks. So 10 units of difficulty per 2 weeks. What does that mean? I have no idea, right? It's sort of, it's more useful within the context of multiple sprints in a company, because I can say, okay, that was a slower sprint, that was a faster sprint, and what might be the reasons why. So you don't have to worry about that for your specific projects, but it's a very interesting concept, right? It's a different way of measuring the performance indicators of a development team. And it's one that's unique to Agile. And so I thought it might help provide a little color as to what makes Agile a little bit different within an organization, and what does it enable you to measure to assess the performance of your organization versus more of a waterfall, big project oriented organization.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, well, let's take our break now. Again, this is sort of an inflection point for the whole class. So it's a great place to take a break, sort of palate cleanse, and then we'll start talking about GitHub. The next part is going to be very much a follow along. I'll probably exit out of the slides and go into GitHub a little bit to show you how to get things set up. Follow along. If you get lost, please send a chat. If I don't see your chat because I'm like head deep in GitHub or something, feel free to call me out, right? Help each other out. Say, hey, professor, there's a chat. Can you please check it out? Because I want to make sure that we are very well aligned today, because that will set you up for success down the next couple of weeks as you start coding your prototype. So let's take a break until 4:14, then come back and we will start the next phase of this course, which is collaborative coding. Oh, by the way, if you're still there and you have not created your GitHub account, or you have not downloaded your text editor, this would be a good time to do that, because you'll need that to follow along. Okay, it is 4:14, so let's get back online. One thing that I failed to remember on this slide was DoD. DoD is definition of done. And so it's essentially just the team aligning with each other about what it means to complete a specific task. So obviously that feeds into the Scrum board. The best way to illustrate that on your Scrum board would just to be very descriptive on your to-dos about what exactly you're trying to accomplish. And yeah, Mary says not Department of Defense. That's what I thought when I was looking at it, because we actually do a lot of work with Department of Defense. And I was like, wait, what does this have to do with Agile? No, it is Department of Done, or definition of done. And so it's essentially just aligning about what it means to complete something. Now, oftentimes the definition of done is actually, is this releasable to the customer? I won't be that strict with you all. I think definition of done would be something more along the lines of, does the function actually do something, right? Because what you're trying to illustrate for me is that you can use code to do cool things on the screen. If you can do that, then I am confident that I've taught you what you need to know to self-teach the rest of your way towards being a great coder, if that's what you want to do, right? So that's sort of my minimum metric of, did I get you going on the path that I wanted to enable for you and that I wish that I had when I was at KGI. So just a little philosophical, what am I looking at when I'm looking at what you all need to know and what you all need to show me to show that you did a good job? That's where my head is at. Okay. Anything else about Agile that percolated up during the 10-minute break that you'd like to ask before we move on to something completely different? All right, here we go. GitHub. What is GitHub? Not completely different, because we're still talking about team collaboration, but GitHub is not inherently attached to Agile methodology in any way, shape, or form. It's not attached to MVP or any of those concepts in any way, shape, or form. It is sort of the framework, the bones through which 90% of all developers work to work on a software project as a team. Version control is another big word that you hear when you talk about that. Why do I need version control? What is GitHubbing doing in that sense? Essentially, what it's enabling me to do and enabling my teammates to do is work on the same code, push changes into the repository, and I can see exactly what happens. So I don't have to worry about someone accidentally deleting everything, or if they do, I can recover that by just reverting back to a previous version. So this is something that we're going to focus a lot on throughout the rest of the lecture. And it can get complicated. So there's a lot of stuff that GitHub forces upon developers, like merging branches, that maybe you'll decide as a team you don't really want to do because you're just keeping it really simple. But just in a nutshell, why these things are important that I'm about to show you, it's because let's say that I am working on the main page HTML file, and I'm changing it to hello world, hello physicians, we're the greatest, best app that you've ever seen. Come enjoy what we're about to show you. Meanwhile, my teammate is working on maybe like embedding a video onto that page. But my teammate is working on the old language on that page that just says hello world. So how do we reconcile that? How do we make sure that my text and my teammate's video end up on the same page? And we'll talk a little bit about how that works. It gets weird, I'm not gonna lie. And one way to get around it is to try not to work on the exact same file at the exact same time. This isn't Google Docs where you can just do that. It just doesn't work that way. So my biggest piece of advice is try to work on independent files as much as possible. You know, maybe I'm working on the main page in 1 week and you're working on the About Us, and another teammate is working on the maybe like the algorithm page, right, where it diagnoses a disease. So that's really what I would recommend. Just try not to work on the same file, because if you do, it's gonna get messy. Okay. So we're going to talk about clones, issues, branches, pull requests, and merges. Clones is the very first thing. So a clone is, how do you take what's in a GitHub repository and get that onto your computer? So let's say that I want to join an existing project, and I want to put that project's code onto my computer. I'm going to clone that code. Okay. So that'll be the first thing we talk about. Step one, we're going to use something called GitHub Pages, which is just kind of a nifty way. You don't need servers. You don't need any of that fancy stuff. GitHub will just host your website on the internet for you. And the cool thing is you'll be able to go to your page at username.github.io, and you'll see your website is right there. And if you change the code to be an About Me blog, whatever, you want to put your resume on it, you can do that, and suddenly it's on the internet. So what you will be building will be accessible online to anyone on their phone, on their laptops, what have you. So it's kind of cool. You know, we're getting code onto the internet for anyone to view. Did anybody have trouble creating their account and creating their repository? Is there anyone would like me to dive into this a little bit? I don't see hands, so that's a good sign. So I'm going to switch over from slides to going onto my GitHub page. I'd encourage you all to right now go to your GitHub page. So hopefully you created your account, all that's there, should be pretty simple. So if I'm here, or not here, let me go to just the home, right? If I'm at GitHub and I'm logged in and I'm home, I can see that there might be some recent repositories. If you don't have one yet, just click new and then name your repository according to this slide, right? So in my case, it's wrosh.github.io, but in your case, it'll be whatever you named your username. Make it public. If you want, you can check these. It actually probably won't matter for you. And then you'll end up with something that looks something like this. You're going to have less files. You're probably just going to have maybe the license, README, maybe an index. If you don't, you can create the files. So I would encourage you to create a file. And this is one thing that you have to do. It's called .nojekyll. So create a new file and then call it .nojekyll. It doesn't have to be anything in the file. It's just nojekyll. This is just sort of a thing that you got to do to skip this helper that GitHub has created in GitHub Pages, because I think they intended people to use it for blogging. And if you do nojekyll, you're basically saying, hey, I'm not trying to use this for blogging. So don't give me all the weird helper stuff. And I forget, do you already have an index.html, or is that something that you have to build? Okay, sounds like no, based on head shaking that I saw. So you can also create a file. You can call it index.html. And then you can just type something like, hello world. And then you can commit it. Your file is going to end up being a lot more fancy than that, but just so that it's there. Okay, and then you'll start creating some of these folders. SRC, it's just a place where I like to put all of my CSS and JavaScript files. In this case, these files are really empty. It's just a commented line that says, hey, add your CSS here. And then same with JavaScript, add scripts here. You don't have to put in SRC, but I like to separate those files from the HTML files. And so I usually create a new folder to put them in. Same with images. If you save your images to your repository, I just don't like to have a folder that has like 50 files. So I like to try to distinguish them here. And if you do that, you're just going to have to make sure that when you reference that image, that you include the folder name and the path to find the image. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. Okay, so one thing I would like whoever is going to be the project manager of your teams, you can all do it if you want, but really it's whoever is the project manager. I would like you to share your code with your teammates. Okay. I wonder if I deleted my slide on that. I thought it was going to be next.
Question.
Yes.
I don't know if it's this way for HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but I know GitHub for Python is a little wonky when you're sharing PC to Mac users. For me, it's gotten very wonky. And does that happen with all coding, or is it something specific to Python?
Well, it depends on the definition of wonky. I will say that wonky things definitely happen relative to GitHub, because there's a little bit of a learning curve with how to use branching and all of that, and we'll get into that a little bit. But it's definitely something where there's a good chance that there will be some sort of conflict between the code that you have on your computer and the code that is in the repository. And it'll be something along the lines where GitHub will say, hey, you are like one file ahead on changes to the repository. And the repository is also one file ahead on certain changes. So what that will mean is that maybe you edited a file and then someone else committed that same file with changes to GitHub. And so then there's work that you have to do to reconcile them, right? You have to say, am I okay with the changes that were already committed? Are we also okay with my changes? How do we merge them to make sure that they don't end up missing certain changes that were important? So it gets wonky. And that's where like my honest advice is just don't work on the same file. If you don't work on the same file, you won't have any of these problems. But if you do, you're going to use branches and merging to do so. And I will talk about that in the time that we have left today. Okay. Okay, so, and it's sort of, Google Docs are a great collaborative tool, and we can see that we can make edits in real time, but GitHub will never be Google Docs because of the necessity of version control. We don't want real-time edits. We want edits to be moments in time where I made a change to the code. I pushed that change to the code that was version 6 or whatever for that file. And that way, if we decide, hey, that wasn't so great, let's go back, we can do so. Okay. So did everyone create the No Jekyll? Did that go okay? Thumbs ups. Okay, cool. I see nods. So that satisfies me. Now, if you are the PM, or alternatively, if you're just the person who we want to use your repository for the code, then go to settings. You're going to go to collaborators. It's going to ask for my password, make sure that I am me, right? Because this is actually, it's an important page, right? If I've got a very important project and I share to someone who's going to sabotage my project, that's bad news, right? So the reason they ask for my password is they're just making sure that I am me, I am the admin, and I'm allowed to do this. So once you're here, go ahead and add people. Just add their email of your team members, and then they should get an invite to join your team. Now that I'm here, so I made a mistake here. These are some old collaborators that I don't want to have access to my repository, right? In this case, not really a huge deal. This is just an example repository that doesn't really mean anything. But if it was something that was very important to me, that would have been shame on me for not removing the user access, because once I'm no longer working with them, having these like sort of legacy users who could mess with the code could be a big problem. Okay, that's like the number one thing. If you are working in software and you have customers who are sophisticated clients and they have security teams that want to vet the software that they use, they will ask you, what controls do you have in place around user access? And then you'll have to tell them, hey, we audit it every month. We make sure that no one is left there who doesn't need the access, that sort of thing. Okay. Mary, question?
Yeah, obviously you're going to share with all your teammates. Do we also add you and share it with you?
I don't think I'll need to. If you want, you can. But
what if we have we make an appointment and there's a specific coding question?
Yeah, so I need access to your repository, but you should make your repository public, right?
Okay.
And then as long as you do that, it shouldn't be a problem. You just give me the link. And by the way, there is a spot on your Scrum docs where you can put the link to your repository and make sure that it's the right one. You know, sometimes like last year, I remember a few teams, they used multiple links, which is perfectly fine, but just make sure that it's clear which is the link to the latest and greatest that you'd be okay with me looking at, if that makes sense. And then that way I can help understand where there might be problems and where I can be the most helpful. Okay, so you can go ahead and invite those people. Another thing, this is new. This is new, annoying, but also good that it exists. Tokens. So GitHub, as of September of last year, they decided, you know what, simple passwords are no longer sufficient to maintain security on our platform. So we want to force everyone to use multi-factor authentication tokens. And then in this case, whoever is owning the repository will have to go to github.com/settings/tokens. And I will just put that in here. And so then if I go to that link, you can see that I've already generated a token. You haven't. So what you'll do is you'll generate a new token. Just a quick description, like I'm putting developer access. How long you want it to last, I would recommend for you, just go with 90 days so that it lasts through the end of the class. And then this is the big reason I think that they're emphasizing tokens. I can then control the type of access that they get. So in this case, we want to give them repo. So that's the repository access. Don't really want them to access any of this other stuff. I don't want them to be able to invite new users or anything like that. If you're okay with that, go for it. But the only ones that I'm going to check for this example are repository access and then discussion access so that people can contribute to a discussion about the code base. If you then generate the token, oh, oops. So let's call this example access. Then generate the token, and it's going to give me a very strange password that you can then copy and then go ahead and put that in your Scrum doc. It's not really the safest practice, but you're not really protecting anything. So this will be fine for the purposes of your project. And then, by the way, if you decide at the end of the project that, hey, now this actually means something, like I want to get funding for it and all that, and only one of my team members is still interested in working on it, then what you can do is delete the token, create a new one, and then all of a sudden only you and whoever that teammate was who wanted to continue working on it will have access. Does that make sense? So that would enable you to continue to work on your class project, but now all of a sudden it's a little bit more private and protected, and you can now share this new token with whomever you want. So go ahead and put that in the Scrum docs. And then let's go backwards a bit. So now that we're done with the GitHub stuff. Okay, so just a few specifications on the prototype. So roles, I think we already have talked about this enough. I don't really need to go through this again. In terms of content, I'd like to see that you have headers, that you have text, that you have images. I want to see that you have buttons that actually perform a function. So put the button in, have the button do something. Lots of things buttons could do. A button could go to a different HTML page, right? So maybe you have your index.html, which is the main page, and maybe there's a button on there that takes you to the diagnosis page. And then that uses JavaScript to create a diagnosis, something like that, right? Button could also be used to reveal something. Maybe you have a table or a map that is hidden when a user visits a page, but then you can click that button, and with a handy bit of JavaScript, just probably like 3 or 4 lines, you can have it now reveal the map or reveal the table. And if you want, instead of it just to appear, for it to like slide down and look kind of cool, you could do it that way too. Those are things we'll go through. Mary?
Are we allowed to use Python instead of JavaScript?
No.
You tease, Professor Tease.
The main reason, oh, that's right, I put that here. I think that's what I've found out is that is a full semester class to integrate Python. And it's also very annoying to try to get every person's computer set up to do it. And so it just ends up being a waste of other classmates' time as we try to figure out how to configure every computer the right way. I would love to do it someday, but unfortunately, the nice thing about JavaScript is you don't need to install anything on your computer. And so it just works. The other thing is GitHub Pages is it does not accommodate Python. So if you wanted to use Python, you would have to essentially pay for server space.
But no, it does. It does now. I use it for a couple Python projects.
Oh, on GitHub Pages?
And you can have it linked.
Okay, so that could be something that we talk about then. If that's a new feature, I'll look into that and see how doable it would be to incorporate. So yeah, I think that could substitute for it. I will confess that I am skeptical that this is going to work, but I'm happy to work with you and look into what we can do to make it happen. Okay. I want to see inputs. So I want to see that a user can talk to the web page, whether through a form or some other means, clicking something, etc. And then from that, an output could be created that sort of demonstrates or looks like a function that satisfies a user story. So I emphasize sort of inputs into outputs, because that's what most pages, what most web pages, well, Web 2.0 pages are. So I don't know the difference between Web 1.0 and Web 2.0. Anyone? Pablo.
Yeah, so Web 1.0 was like sending emails and like very like intro use of the internet, and then like Web 2.0 was like Twitter, Facebook, more like social media.
Yeah, so Web 2.0, 100%. Twitter, Facebook are great, maybe some of the best examples of Web 2.0, where I, as a user or a web browser, can do things on the web page that change it, right? So on Facebook, if I like an image, which is the most simple possible thing, or on Instagram, I like an image, that has now changed their platform forever in the most insignificant way, but it has now been changed because Instagram, Facebook, they have enabled me as a user to interact with their page. 1.0, just to add another thing about that, is more the web page is there, but it's not really trying to interact with me. It's trying to talk to me, right? So maybe a blog or a newspaper website, right? A journalist website, or maybe I don't know, something else like that, right? Whereas they are creating what's more called a static web page, and they want me to come to the page, they want me to view the page, but they don't want me to do anything with the page. Okay. And now people are talking about Web 3.0. Don't worry about that, but that is like a blockchain crypto thing. And the concept there is that the whole thing is decentralized. It's like, imagine Twitter, but the company Twitter doesn't exist. And it's just built on a protocol that enables me to send tweets and stuff without Jack Dorsey, Elon Musk, whomever, trying to determine what's allowed and what's not.
But isn't Web 3.0 for VR and AR applications? AR project.
Oh, that, you know, some people might have called it Web 3.0 at one point, but right now, sort of the people who have stolen that trademark are taking over the branding of Web 2.0 are the blockchain folks. So I think the reason is because so VR, AR, in some ways that's a little bit more 1.0, but very fancy, right? Because it's sort of a new way to view an application. Now, of course, there's ways to interact, which are more 2.0 as well. But it's not a fundamental change in how web protocols work, right? Whereas enabling users to interact with the page was a fundamental change in how web protocols work. And I want you all to demonstrate that you know how to use that and create that on a web page, okay? All right, and then data visuals. So make it look pretty. I don't want to see like just a bunch of words on a page. I want to see some design, some CSS, maybe some images, charts, graphics. I'll show you ways to incorporate things like Google Maps into your page, embed videos from YouTube, Vimeo, what have you. And as I show you that, I want you to try to do it yourself, right? Or try to do something that I didn't show you. But just because I've given you the tools and how to use some of these applications, I want you to put them into practice. Another question, Mary?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I have so many questions.
No worries.
Where does the front end end and the back end start in terms of your content list?
Yeah. So front end is most commonly referred to by what is blatantly showing up in the page design. So it's like HTML, CSS. The HTML is the bones or the content of the page. And then the CSS is sort of like the skin, the eyes, the hair color, the hair type, all that. Sort of how do things look, right? JavaScript it's sort of straddling the two, right? JavaScript, it's really more commonly thought of as a front end tool. because what it's doing is it's helping things show up, maybe making them spin around, move around, what have you. And you'll see that as you do the Code Academy courses. But it looks more like a backend language. So for the purpose of this class, I'm comfortable calling it backend, because with the ifs and the for loops, iterating through data structures and all that, that is specifically a backend task, right? So when we talk about backend, we talk about parsing and manipulating and reading, retrieving, saving data. And we're going to be able to use JavaScript to do that. The data is not going to live in a database. So it's like a little bit, you know, we're cheating a little bit there. But a true pure backend language like Python, something that doesn't even show up on the user's screen, right? But what it does is it enables you to create data structures or answers that help fill in something on someone's screen. So let's use Instagram as an example, right? The way that I show all the images of someone that I'm viewing, that's done with front end code. And that code is saying, I want the image to be this big. I want it to maybe change colors ever so slightly when you highlight over it. If you click it, I want it to get bigger. All that stuff is front end code. But back end code is playing around with the database, saying, okay, we are on Mary's Instagram page. And because we're on Mary's Instagram page, we know using our backend code that Mary has 100 images that she's ever shared on Instagram. So let's display all of those images. The backend code is figuring out where are those images, what do they look like, blah, blah, blah. And then it's saying, okay, show 100 images. And it's telling the front end code, do that. And then the front end code is saying, okay, we know what an image is supposed to look like size-wise, how it sort of fills out a grid, all that. And so they take those inputs, or I guess outputs, sorry, from the backend code, and then they turn that into a nice looking grid of images. So the backend code is sort of playing around with the data, figuring out what data do I associate with a given page, so on and so forth. And then the front end code is taking those outputs and making them look like anything. Without the front end code, those outputs, they don't look like anything. It might just be like a list of image URLs, right? But that doesn't mean anything. The front end code displays that into a format that's actually viewable by the user. Does that answer your question? Okay, cool. Great questions. And these are fundamental questions of web development. So definitely happy to spend as much time as we need to try to get those basic concepts ingrained into your knowledge base. Okay, a little bit about Git version control. So the first thing you do to get a repository onto your computer is you clone it as a branch. And then if you want to work on a new feature without bothering anyone else, then you can define that branch, and maybe I would call it Will's branch about us, right? Because I'm going to work on the about us page. And then I can do whatever I want with it. Maybe I can push several changes into GitHub that aren't reflected in what actually shows up on the web page. And then as a team, we can review that new feature branch and then merge it back into the code so that it shows up on the page. You won't always do this. And in fact, some of you may not do it at all. I don't expect that you necessarily will do it. But that would be how you work on a long stretch of code that maybe requires several tries, several iterations, that you just don't want it to show up on the page immediately. It's most useful if you're doing something that users are using all the time. And of course, you don't want to push a bunch of changes that might be visible to the users before they're ready, right? And maybe while I'm working on something, I want someone else to be able to push changes to the user without them having to wait for me to finish up. And that's where branches come in handy. Sort of like I can pull a little slice of code out, do a bunch of work over the course of time that I need to do it, and then merge it back in when it's ready. And we as a team agree that it's good, okay? But I will warn you, if you play around with branches, sometimes you might say, wait, what's going on? I'm trying to push code to the web page and nothing's happening. That's usually going to be because somehow you ended up on a branch and you forgot about it, and you hadn't merged that branch. And maybe by the time you realized you needed to do that, now there's discrepancies. You're going to have to reconcile those discrepancies. So just a warning that it can get, I think in Mary's words, wonky if you use the branches, but you forget how you're using them, right? So just have to be careful. But I do want to teach it to you because it's a very fundamental concept in how collaborative coding works.
Wonky is an official KGI catch-all word, FYI.
I think
Everyone knows.
wonky is it definitely is part of the developer vernacular as well. So you all will fit right in if you decide to become web developers. Okay, check if you have Git. So I have these examples of how you can open a command prompt on Windows and Mac. There is a third option, which is simply opening up your Visual Studio Code. And I will just exit out of here and show you mine. So here's mine. There is another option, right? If I've got this open, I can just click the terminal drop down and then new terminal, and then it'll show up here, okay? So that is an option too. That's sort of why I like Visual Studio Code, because it's just got everything in one thing. So I don't have to tell you to download more things. Okay, so either open it up through these instructions or through your VS Code, and then in the terminal line, type git space version and then enter, and then see if you've got it. Can I maybe get a thumbs up if you have it, and maybe a thumbs down if you don't? That'll help me know if I need to show you how to download it. Okay, so we do have some thumbs downs. This is the part that sort of sometimes drives me nuts and will definitely drive some of you nuts. It's just getting everything set up. And then, to Mary's question about Python, that adds a whole nother order of magnitude of, computer needs to be properly set up with software. So that's my main misgiving about trying to set everyone up on that. But if people are willing to put in the work, then more than welcome to try something like Python. Okay, so to install, follow these links. And I'll just paste them into the chat for everyone to use. So the one that's /win is for Windows. The one that is /Mac is for Mac. And if you don't have Windows or Mac, then you probably don't need me because you're probably already a developer using Linux or something like that. Okay. So if you go on there, then it gives you some instructions for how to install Git. So that's Mac, and then Win. So for the Mac, these instructions are basically just commands that you will type into your terminal, okay? So if I'm going back to my terminal, I would type brew install git right here. And then if I'm on Windows, I would just do that with my command prompt or within my VS Code, okay? All right, sorry. On Windows, you would not do brew install git. On Windows, you would follow the different instructions. Right, so these ones. Okay. So that's something I would encourage you to check out. If it's not working for any reason on your computer, that's okay. Just let me know. And then we'll try to work through the issues. Okay. If you have Git, or once you get Git, there's an important thing. It's on the same terminal that you use to figure out if you have Git. Type this command. And this is Leilani?
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. Do you have these slides available on Canvas?
You know what? I don't, because I hadn't used Canvas for that purpose, but I can put them on there. And then in addition, I will post this on YouTube, as I've been doing, so that you can definitely go back and review what we went over. Okay.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, so this is important. It's a common problem once people have gotten Git, is that they haven't configured it. And configuring it is basically just typing this git config space -- global space user.name space double quotes will, or your name, end quotes. And then after you do that, do the same thing, but with email. Okay, this is telling Git who you are, and try to use the same email as what you signed up for on GitHub. Okay.
Can we download the Git extension on the Visual Studio Code, or we have to go through that website?
You could do both. So it's sort of whatever works. I would encourage you to try to do it through the website first. And if that doesn't work, try it using the extension on VS Code. But this is one of those things where there's about 20 different ways to do this properly, and about 100 different ways to not get it done right, because of whatever, it's like the version of operating system that you've got, or something like that. So there's definitely no like perfect answer for everyone, but I'm trying to give you the links so that you can figure out the right solution for you. And this step, honestly, is a lot of trial and error until you get it right. And I'm here to help. Okay. So remember, our fearless leaders had created tokens for a repository. Once they've put that on the Scrum docs, or maybe they put it on the Scrum docs already, you'll have to set your Git remote. Okay, so before you actually even get here, what you need to do is make sure that you're in the right place on your terminal. So when I say the right place, I mean, if I type a command called pwd, it will show me where I am. So I'm within my documents folder, under a folder called sample project, and then within wrosh.github.io. You're not going to be able to do this because you haven't cloned the repository yet. But what you can do is make sure that you navigate to the place that you want to be. So I know I'm in documents, maybe, or actually I'm in this like sample project. So CD means change directory. And if I do .. / it takes me backwards a folder. So now I can see that I'm not within the wrosh.github, but I'm within sample project. Maybe I want to change directory one more just to get into documents. Now I can see I've got all my document stuff, right? So I could maybe create a folder in here. You don't have to use the terminal to do it. You could, but if you want to just sort of go into the folder, your documents folder, and then create a folder called sample project, or whatever you want to call it, KGI, what have you, then you can do that. And then make sure you just navigate into the project that you want to navigate into. So I navigated into sample project, and now I'm in the right place. So once I'm in the folder where I want to essentially download the repository files, Now I can go back into the slides and I can set my remote as whatever the GitHub link is. Okay, so this is another thing, and we don't have to do this now, but I just want to walk through this with you right now. Until you do this, you won't be able to push and pull code from into the repository. So that long token that your team leader, or I should maybe just say a Scrum Master created, that will replace this ABC123. So what you'll need to do is do whatever the username of the repository is, colon, that long token at github.com, and then slash whatever their repository is. Okay, so if we go back home, this is my repository link, right? So this is the home page of my repository. So if I paste it here, you can kind of see where the similarity is. So you'll just need to get that link from your Scrum Master and then just make a few changes, right? So this is the username, so I'm going to copy it over to here, colon, a bunch of weird characters, and then @. So it's sort of that token at github.com. And then the rest of it can just remain almost the same, except now I have to add .git to the end, because that's the actual directory for the repository. Another way you can find that, if I just want to find that here, is under this code, HTTPS, copy that, and then you'll just see, again, very similar. I just need to sort of do those manipulations. All right, copy the name over here, type the token at github.com/ the rest of this stuff. Okay, so that's going to be the link that you're going to need to do to set as your remote origin. Okay, Tyler. I think for some reason I can't hear you. It doesn't look like you're on mute.
Sorry, different microphone.
Okay, okay.
Are we doing this all on command prompt or terminal?
Yes. So that this code from here on out, like when I use this code, it usually means it's code that you'll put into your command prompt. Sometimes it'll actually be like actual code that you'll put on into your code editor, but for this, it's all within the command prompt. I would definitely encourage you to use the Visual Studio Code just so that you have everything in one place. But if you like the command prompt or the terminal, which I kind of use it because it's what I'm used to, then that's perfectly legit as well. All right. And you'll have this, I'll definitely post the slides, and then you'll have the YouTube of the lecture as well. So just a few commands that I sort of hinted at a few. ls lists the files in the current directory. CD and then something will change to a new directory. So if you want to go into the documents folder, you do just CD space documents. It has to be sort of within the files in your current directory though. Okay, so just sort of type ls, see the folders, files that you might want to get into, and then you can CD into there. Git clone will download the GitHub repository onto your computer. Git status, you'll see the differences between your code and GitHub. Git add will help you stage a changed file for committing. Commit will commit those files. So you'll add one file at a time once you're done changing it to your liking. And then you'll commit a group of files. It could just be the one file, But the commit is saying, okay, I'm done. And I'm ready to try to get this into the repository as a new change. So once you've finished sort of your work in that sense, then you'll commit those files. You'll write a description as to what that change was. And then finally, you will push it to the repository. So that's sort of merging what you've committed into the repository for everyone else to see. Okay. Those are commands that you would just type on the terminal. Now, here's another reason why I want you to use VS Code, because there's this source control tab, which actually does all of that for you. So if I change a file, hello world to hello worlds, then I can see the change that was made. And rather than typing get add, I can just stage them using the plus button. I can then commit, say, changing hello world, to worlds, enter. And now all of a sudden that's ready to push. And then I can push it just by clicking this button. Okay, now I get an error. This happens. Open up the Git log. What happened? Okay, so it says rejected. Failed to push some references to github.com because the remote contains work that you do not have locally. This is usually caused by another repository pushing to the same ref. You may want to first integrate the remote changes before pushing again. Okay, so this is where it gets wonky sometimes, right? It's if something has changed in my repository and that is not reflected in my local code base. Usually that's because I am working on the same file as someone else. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to git pull. Okay. So I did git pull. And I'm going to try pushing again. And now it's good. Okay, I didn't get an error. So git pull, it's kind of, so you clone the repository and what I told you earlier, right? That is downloading it to your local computer. Pull is what you do after you've cloned, which is pull is basically saying, okay, I'm about to do a bunch of work, but before I do that, I want to make sure that my code base and what's on GitHub are the same. So you're not like re-downloading everything, but you're just creating little updates to your files to make sure that they are the same as what's on GitHub. And that way, when you make your changes and you push them forward, you're not going to have this weird situation where it's like, oh, because you didn't pull, you didn't like incorporate the nav bar that someone else had done earlier in the day. And now it doesn't know whether you wanted to actually get rid of the nav bar because it's not in your code, or whether you just had forgotten to pull. So by pulling frequently, basically pulling before you do your work, you will prevent those conflicts from happening, right? So it's good that I had that little snafu because you almost certainly will too. And this can show you how you might be able to get around that. So it's almost like the opposite of saving, right? You know, people always say save frequently, save your work, because you never know when your computer might crash and you'll lose it all. This is like the opposite, where it's like pull all the time, because before you do any work, you want to make sure that you're aligned. Otherwise, you might be doing work on sort of an obsolete version of the software. So it's like, the reason I say it's the opposite is like, instead of saving your work, what you're trying to do is grab other people's saved work. Okay. Any questions about that? So for cloning, the team lead will invite collaborators to the project. We've done that, hopefully, or if we haven't, we'll do that after class. Then here's what I was talking about with navigate to the folder that you want to save your code to. In my case, I like to save to documents, maybe you prefer desktop, something like that. That's up to you. And then clone the code from GitHub. And so that's here. Okay. Now, of course, remember, you had to have also installed Git. You had to configure it in what we showed in the early slides. You have to have the token. You have to have the link. Once you've done that, you're ready for this page. And then you cross your fingers, hold your breath, whatever you do for good luck, and then hope that all that code ends up on your computer. Okay. And then once that's happened, that means you are now ready for the next phase, which is actually coding. It's a crazy thing about coding is like getting your computer set up is, I find sometimes equally hard as the coding itself. But once it's set up, you're now set up actually for future coding projects. So it's sort of just that initial initiation energy required to get your computer ready to code. Once that's done, now you're empowered to code future projects whenever you want. And the fact that you're doing this on GitHub is also giving you an advantage because now you are set up in the same way that 95+% of developers in the world are set up. So if you decide you want to work on some cool project that someone's got on GitHub, you can start talking to them, collaborating with them. GitHub is like a very boring social media for developers, but it's so powerful because it's where they all are, that it's honestly, people get jobs through GitHub. So you just sort of start helping out on someone's project. They like working with you. And then maybe they want you to join their startup, or maybe they already work for an established company and they want someone else on their team. They know you through, they're collaborating with you on GitHub. So this is a very powerful, it's a very powerful tool to get to know how to use and to become established on. So once you've done that, you can then open index.html with the text editor. So the easiest, simplest way to do it, you know, with terminal, you can do it from VS Code, but the easiest, simplest way is just open up the folder in documents, desktop, wherever it might be. Right click the index.html file and then open it with your code editor. And then once you do that, you'll have something that looks very similar to this. And then that's when you can start coding. Another thing, since we're looking at my code editor, if you want to actually see what it's going to look like before you commit it to GitHub, what you can do is you can right click index.html, copy path, and then go to your browser. Close that out. And then that path that you copied, just paste it into your browser URL space. Look at that, hello worlds. So now I can see the work that I've done on my local computer because my browser, and all browsers do this, Chrome, Firefox, Safari, what have you. It can reach into your local computer because you're giving it permission to do that. And then it can show you what index.html looks like. Okay. So let's just do one little change. I don't like that hello worlds is sort of all the way to the left, all the way at the top. I think that looks weird. Usually websites have some sort of margin to them. So you might be familiar with that from your CSS work on Codecademy. So what I'm going to do, we'll create CSS for it someday. But right now, let's just go lazy. And I'm going to do a style. And I'm just going to say margin is 20 pixels. So that's just going to give it a 20 pixel margin all around, top, bottom, left, right. Okay. So I'm going to just move the end of the P element down there. So now I have hello worlds is a P element with a style saying that it has a margin of 20. Let's actually make that even more. Let's call it 40. And now I saved the file. So if I reload this page, there, now I got margins that I'm comfortable with. Let's also change the color. Color equals red. And then let's also say font size is 50. I want big red hello worlds. Reload. Boom. Cool. So play around with that. There's no expectation at this point that you have like a super functional site or that you're already building buttons and stuff. This is the week to do two things. One, get set up. Try to figure out how to download the code to your computer. Get all that stuff. And then figure out, can you get to the point where you are making changes to your index file? You are then opening up that index file using copy path, putting it into your browser, pasting that in, and then seeing it. Cool. Any questions about that? If you can do that. Oh, go ahead.
Will this lecture be online as well? So we can look back?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'll try to hurry up with that. I'll try to get that on YouTube. And then I'll also put the slides on there. This is, like I was sort of alluding to at the beginning, this is a very important lecture. I think the subsequent lectures are more incremental teaching. Like I know what I need to show you to make sure that you understand how to use these skills to create a web page. This is the part where it's just a little bit weird. Some of you are going to really struggle to get set up, and I'm here to help you do that, right? Because I don't want you to go 3 weeks where you're like, man, I just like never figured out Git, therefore I haven't done anything with my project. Okay, so let's try to get this right at the beginning, so that as a team, you all can focus on building the prototype that you want to build. Mary?
Yeah, in terms of a solid MVP, and how many being like a potential solution for multiple user stories, how many user stories should we aim for?
It's a difficult question to answer. You can build a very good MVP off of a single user story. And the question is just, so there was an earlier slide where we talked about what's required for a successful prototype project. And if the user story is such that it involves doing all of those things, ergo showing me that you learned the fundamentals of coding to a satisfactory level where you can now take those skills to empower yourself in the future, then that's a winning project, right? But if maybe you really want to do this one user story, but it doesn't involve data visuals, something like that, then maybe you're going to have to do another one to actually satisfy that part of the project, right?
But
go ahead.
Is there one that may be better? Like, would it be better maybe to have a 1 to 2 like macro level, very broad user stories, or a few that are narrowing down on specific things that users might be looking for?
I think it's best to focus on a main user story.
Broad.
But sometimes that main user story, you realize, could actually be broken down further into smaller user stories, and that's perfectly legitimate to do as well. This is very much an it depends type of answer. Depends on the project, depends on sort of what you're able to accomplish within the scope of a single user story. Also depends on whether you have a coherent app from a single user story. You probably will, because that's sort of the point of a user story, right? Is the user wants to do something, you're going to enable them to do it. But you might find that like one user story looks really lonely without the other one, you know? And it's really going to depend on how the project is formulated. But definitely a place where you want to err on the side of simplicity, right? Because if you're too complex, it's really going to be hard to take these very new skills that you have to build a functioning app, right? Focus on function, focus on building something cool and then showing it to the class, right? Okay. Status, we already went through that. Git status you can do in the terminal as long as you're in the right folder, and you've set the remote origin as we showed in an earlier slide. But I also showed that it shows up on your VS Code, so that you might find that that interface is more to your liking. Same with adding, with staging, we already talked about that. Same with committing. Branching, so if you want to create a branch, you would do a command that is called git checkout -b, and then whatever you want to call that. So I might call that Will's About Us project. That would be how I check out a branch. And then to push it, I'm going to use this command, and then it will go to GitHub. I could also, because Visual Code allows me to be a little bit more lazy in that way, I could just use this and go to the source control. I can check out using here, or I could create branch using here. And just you could play around with these. But again, if you want to do a branch, like make sure that as a team you need to, right? Talk about that during your stand-up meeting. And if you need to, this is how you do it. But if you don't need to, don't bother. It's more work that you don't have to worry about. Okay. Merging. So once you push a branch in, you'll notice, perhaps to your frustration, if you forgot about this slide, that the GitHub page has not changed at all. That's because you need to merge. So the project leader can merge the pull request using a workflow on GitHub called pull requests. So you'll see an open pull request, and then as a team, maybe during your stand-up meeting, you could open that up, make sure that everything looks good, and then decide that you want to merge it in, right? So that might be the team leader, or the project manager, might be the QA person that's sort of working with the project manager to do that. That will be how you actually update the GitHub page, okay? Oh, and by the way, because I don't think I showed you, the page itself, if you want to view it, is this. So your name.github.io, if you created the page the way that sort of showed in the lecture. So I do that, and then this is hello world. Anyone want to guess why it's not big, bold red? Instead, it's just this small text. This is my final question, last chance for participation, and then I'll just go through the assignments, and then we're done. Mary?
You didn't specifically tell your code to change the font size. You just told it what color. So it's outputting its default font type and size.
Kind of. So I did tell the code here, but the code I didn't tell was the GitHub code. So this is just my local file, right? It's not actually pushed live to GitHub. So if I'm in the source control panel here, I can see index has been changed, right? All this stuff has been changed. So if I want that to actually reflect on the internet, this http wraj.github.io, instead of just this folder on my computer that no one else can see, I would then stage it using the plus button, commit it saying big red font. Guess that's appropriate that it's in all caps, even though that was a mistake. Push enter. So now it's been committed, push, and now it's been pushed to my GitHub. Right, so now I reload. That takes a few minutes, so it's not ready yet, but that will work in maybe like 2-3 minutes. Okay. All right, so we don't have time to do this. So in the next lecture, I'm going to go through a few basic coding examples. So I'll show you how to link up with JavaScript, link up with CSS on your index page, how to maybe build a nav bar, things like that. So assignments are complete your CSS lessons on Codecademy, complete your usability test reading, because in the next lecture, we'll talk a little bit about human factors, sorry, user testing and all of that. And then start doing those Scrum team meetings. So I want to see that you've filled out more of the Scrum board, maybe that you've deployed a live version of the code. If all it says is hello world, I'm fine with that. If you want to get even fancier, try that out. And then put the link to the repository on your Scrum docs. Okay, so that's it. You're all free to go. I'll stick around the next 5 minutes